Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to week one of Mental Health Mondays presented by Shift Posts for Pharmacy Appreciation Month. We've developed this series to give back to you, our hardworking pharmacy professionals who have been absolutely essential throughout the pandemic. So, thank you for all that you do, all of your amazing hard work and continued efforts. And thank you so much for joining me this evening for our first webinar of our Mental Health Mondays series. My name is Caitlin Lopes. I will be leading you through this series over the next 4 weeks. Tonight's Stress Management for Resiliency webinar explores different kinds of stress and how they're connected to our health. Throughout this webinar, we will be discussing the physiological and emotional manifestations of stress, and we'll be offering some very valuable tips, tools, and coping strategies for managing daily stressors. Our hope is that the content of this webinar will help you to be able to better navigate through stressful periods in your life and will hopefully allow you to be able to also support your family, friends, and patients in dealing with stress as well. So without further ado, let's get into our topic for this evening. So let's start by asking ourselves a few questions, and I want you to consider how much you relate to each of these. So, do you find that you're having trouble coping? Does everything just seem like it's too much? Do you feel stressed out? Is the burnout of the pandemic getting to you, for instance? Do you always feel anxious? And are you feeling overwhelmed? Does there just seem like there's too much on your plate, too much to handle, and that at any point everything could just overflow or explode? Well, if you found yourself answering yes to any of those questions, you're certainly not alone. Canadian community health surveys have consistently collected data which supports that over 6.5 million Canadians feel that most of their days are quite a bit or extremely stressful. Those numbers are as high as 28% of the population for individuals in the 35 to 49-year-old range, which represents over 2 million people alone. Unfortunately, the Statistics Canada website has only published data up until 2020, but we can imagine that the numbers for the past 2 years of the pandemic are similar or slightly higher. And let's explore sources of stress. So, why are people reporting that they feel stress in the first place? Well, 62% say that their stress is work related, 12% related to finances, 12% related to time constraints, 8% related to family, and 6% stated that their stress was from another source. When we talk about stress, what exactly do we mean? Let's define stress. So, according to Richard Lazarus, who was an American psychologist who studied human behavior and stress responses, stress is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. So, in simpler terms, this means that we experience stress when we believe that we don't have the time, resources, or knowledge to handle a situation. So, we experience stress when everything seems like it's out of control. And everybody handles stress a little bit differently in different situations. But you're more likely to handle stress better when you feel confident in your abilities and are able to take control of a situation using strong stress management strategies. But let me ask you this: is all stress bad for us? The answer is no. Another early researcher on stress named Hans Selye put forward the idea of eustress, which is good stress, and distress, which is bad stress. So, distress is what we typically think of when we think of stress. It's stress that negatively affects you. And eustress is stress that actually has a positive effect on you. So he suggested that a mild level of stress can actually encourage people to be more motivated, energized, excited, and active, while an excessive level of stress can hamper performance, cause anxiety, procrastination, and diminish performance. So there is a point at which different stresses in our lives or pressure can actually be beneficial. And things like that are, for instance, when you're buying a new home, that's stressful, but it's good stress because it's leading to hopefully a positive change in your life. Or when you're interviewing for a job, or when you start that job and all of the tasks and duties are a little bit different, that can be a very stressful situation as well, but one that allows us to grow and develop and is actually good stress or eustress. So let's talk about what causes stress. So as we discussed, stress comes up when we feel like the demands of a situation or event are too much to manage. And stress can come up with everyday situations, such as managing demands at home, work, or in academic settings like school. Managing relationships, whether that be professional relationships, friendships, or familial relationships. When we are managing our finances, our financial future, our taxes, things of that nature. When we're dealing with unfair treatment, and when we're managing long-term health problems. Stress can also come up in response to a specific event or situation, and both positive and negative life events can be stressful, especially those that involve major changes to our regular routines. So here are some examples. Changes in a relationship, such as marriage, divorce, new or lost friendships, the rise of conflict, changes in housing arrangements, so buying or selling a home, becoming evicted, moving away, the death of a family member, colleague, friend, or even beloved pet, and changes in your job or other sources of income can be extremely stressful as well. Now let's talk about reactions to stress. When we feel stressed, we tend to respond in one of two ways. The first is by fight or flight response. So, physiologist Walter Cannon's early research on stress revealed that when we experience or perceive a threat, our bodies quickly release hormones that help us to survive. This is the well known fight or flight response, and the release of these hormones often causes our stress to manifest in physical responses, which we'll go over in a few moments. And as I'm sure many of you know, the true purpose of these hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, is to help us survive better, right? So those types of hormones allow us to run faster and fight harder historically. Which is really helpful when we needed to fight off an enemy or run away from danger. But in today's world, we don't have to do those things so much. And the problem with this fight or flight response that our body is programmed to do is that even though it helps us to deal with those life-threatening events, it also now comes up in everyday situations. So, for instance, when we feel under pressure at work, when we are speaking in public, when we experience conflict in our relationships. In any of those examples, I'm sure you can relate that you've felt some uncomfortable feelings, uncomfortable side effects, such as nervousness, anxiety, or even irritability, right? All very normal things. The second reaction to stress is called General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS. GAS is a response to chronic long-term exposure to stress. Hans Selye, who first put forward the theory about general adaptation syndrome, found that when we cope with stress, we do so in some distinct phases. So phase 1 is our just normal level of resistance to stress, and it's the way that our body is trained to react. And phase 2 is the compensation phase or the alarm phase, where we react to the stressor. So it's that onset shock. Phase 3, or the resistance phase, is when we adapt to and cope with the stressor. The body can't keep up resistance indefinitely, so our physical and emotional resources are gradually depleted. And lastly, phase 4 is the decompensation phase or the exhaustion phase. Eventually, we become worn down by that stress and cannot function normally. And that's when we start to see large declines in our health and wellness, both physically and mentally. And it's important to note that fight or flight and the general adaptation syndrome are linked. The exhaustion phase of the general adaptation syndrome comes from an accumulation of many fight or flight responses built up over a long period of time. Okay. Now let's look at manifestations of stress. So everyone reacts to stress differently. However, some physical manifestations, which are common, include tense muscles, rapid breathing and heart rate, headaches, difficulty sleeping well, fatigue, changes in sex drive, and weaker immune system. So sometimes we might attribute these physical sensations to other things in our lives, but it's important to note that stress also causes these things, and to be mindful of that and to check in with ourselves and say, okay, are my muscles tense because I brought in all those groceries yesterday, or are my muscles tense because I'm experiencing a lot of stress in my life, right? Part of that awareness is mindfulness and being connected with our bodies. We also have behavioral manifestations of stress, which can look like withdrawing from others, fidgeting or feeling very restless, moving a little bit more than usual. It can look like turning to vices like smoking, drinking, or using drugs more than usual, and as avoiding situations that you think are stressful. Stress also affects our feelings. So, some changes in your feelings, which you might notice, are feeling worried or confused, feeling angry or irritable, and consistent feelings of being overwhelmed or overloaded. We can also experience changes in our thoughts. So, that can look like struggling to concentrate, remember things, or being very indecisive. It can look like having very negative self-talk or losing your self-confidence. And it can look like pessimistic or negative thinking. So it goes without saying that stress can negatively impact our everyday life, our relationships, and our ability to work effectively. It can be difficult to overcome feelings of stress, but there are a number of different strategies that we can use to reduce the symptoms and manage stress better. These coping strategies include action-oriented, emotion-oriented, and acceptance-oriented strategies. So let's take a look at these in more detail, as well as some practical techniques that you can use for each one. So first, we have our action-oriented strategies. So what can we actively do to cope with our stress? So, the very first thing that is incredibly important is identifying the stressors. So, before you can manage your stress, you need to understand where the feelings are coming from. You can start by taking the Holmes and Rahi stress scale test, which I've included in the handout section of the webinar. It's one of the tabs that you can navigate to. And this test can help you to identify specific events that trigger a stress response and understand what's causing a stress response in your life a little bit better. So, really pinpoint sources of stress down more effectively. And another thing that you can do to help you to identify stressors very specifically is starting a stress diary. So, as you write down events that happen throughout your day or your week or your month, you can think about certain situations which may have made you feel very stressed, as well as your thoughts, feelings, and emotions at the time. And when you do this, you can list the main stressors in order of their impact. So, asking yourself questions like, which stressors affect your health and well being the most? Which stressors affect your work and productivity the most? And just having these instances and the feelings that were tied with those instances written down really helps to give you sort of a better awareness to the stressors in your life. And in doing so, you will be able to use some of our other strategies here to tackle those one by one. A second strategy is by taking control of your workload. So, busy workloads are a very common source of stress for many people, particularly if you have a role such as one within the pharmacy industry where there are many competing tasks throughout the day and you're always on the go. There's always new things interjecting. So, how can we deal with this? Well, learning how to prioritize your workload is incredibly important. So, asking yourself, what's important for me to get done right now? What can wait until later? What can wait until tomorrow? What is the most important thing to do? And ways that we can do this is by writing out tasks in a to do list if we're feeling overwhelmed and reordering them by importance. And this can help you to take an organized, clear, and thorough approach to your workload. Um, if you're really busy at work and the requests are really piling up, then you might need to take a harder line. You might need to ask your manager for more assistance, or perhaps speak to someone about getting more relief work in to ease the burden. And to-do lists don't only help with our jobs, but also our personal lives as well. So your to-do list can look like having grocery shopping on your list, laundry, taking the kids to soccer, even scheduling in your own hobbies and self-care time is important, right? Because those are important things in our mental health and overall well-being. Organization tools are also really great for taking control of our various tasks in life. So for some people, that looks like a planner, a calendar, an hourly schedule, whatever works for you. Developing time management skills is incredibly important. Becoming efficient in the various tasks that you're doing throughout your day, and even setting aside specific amounts of time to complete each so that you will be able to tackle the entire list within the day or whatever allotted amount of time that you have. And making a plan of action is very, very helpful. So let's talk a little bit more about that piece. So how do we make an effective plan of action? So we talked about identifying and defining stressors and more specifically problems, determining our goal, brainstorming possible solutions, which will help us achieve that goal and overcome the problem. And then as you're brainstorming those possible solutions, considering the pros and cons of each possible solution. And then once you've written those out, choosing the best solution for you. We have to remember that the perfect solution rarely exists. It's all about balance. And then we can put our plan into action and evaluate our efforts, and choose another strategy if needed. So this is a really nice set of steps for dealing with any type of stressful situation or conflict in our lives. It's very methodical, and having steps and having that organization or that blueprint can be very helpful for us when we're super stressed out and maybe not thinking so clearly, right? So going back to our action-oriented strategies, a third one is managing your relationships. People can be a significant source of stress too, unfortunately. Things like difficult relationships, conflict at work, or needy colleagues can be very draining and can have a very negative impact on our mental health. So if someone is consistently making you feel very stressed, you can try limiting the amount of time that you spend with them. You can keep conversations strictly work related or short if they're related to your personal life. And what's really important about managing relationships is setting and maintaining firm boundaries. So we truly teach people how to treat us, right? Um, and setting firm boundaries about what type of relationship we'll have and what type of treatment we expect to give and receive is really important for our mental health. And we will have a separate webinar specifically dedicated to boundaries if you're interested in learning more about how to set effective boundaries and why they're so important. But in the meantime, I do really recommend that you check out our handout section and say yes to the person, no to the task, which is a link that I've included. It's one of the first ones in the PDF document. And I really recommend that you read that because I think that it adds a lot of perspective into setting firm boundaries, but also being polite and cordial about it. Okay. And then using effective communication strategies is also very important for dealing with stress because when we are very transparent in the ways that we communicate with people, we reduce the potential for miscommunication, which can often cause conflict and lead to new stressors in our lives, right? So always communicate as effectively as possible by being transparent, being empathetic in your conversations, recognizing your own needs and the needs of others, and so on. Then we have our emotion-oriented strategies. Stress is often caused by how we subjectively perceive a situation, and when we see that it is stressful. And this might be because we get emotional, because we get caught up in negative self-talk, or because we find it hard to stay calm. Emotion-oriented strategies can help. And here are a few examples. So the first is challenging negative thinking. Most of us will experience pessimistic thinking at some point in our lives. But persistent pessimism or negative self-talk can be really damaging to our self-confidence and self-esteem. And this can result in more stress, anxiety, and even depression if left unchecked. It can be very difficult to break free from this cycle of negative thinking, but with practice, it definitely can be done. Tools like cognitive behavioral restructuring and the ABC model can help us to challenge negative thoughts and replace them with more positive, objective, and rational ones. And this in turn can help you to deal with difficult or stressful situations in a healthier, calmer way, and can also help you to maintain a more positive outlook when things are going wrong. So in the handout section, I have included a cognitive restructuring worksheet and an ABC problem solving worksheet. So both of those are targeted at reducing the amount of negative thinking that we're doing, really challenging those thoughts, and creating more positive thinking patterns. Okay. I just want to go over quickly some ways in which we can challenge negative thinking beyond those two resources. And I think it all just comes down to focusing on helpful and realistic thoughts. So we want to focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. So we want to focus how maybe a stressful situation can help to develop our skills or make us stronger, or um, can result in maybe a stronger relationship that we have with somebody by overcoming that those trials and tribulations, right? Another thing can be looking for the challenges in a situation by asking, what can I learn from this, or how can I grow as a person, which also kind of touches on the same thing, looking at the positives, looking at ways in which negative experiences can help us to develop personally and professionally. It's important to try to keep things into perspective. So really asking yourself, is it a hassle or a horror? So something that I like to ask myself is, in 5 years, will this matter? And if the answer is no, then try not to become too hung up on the current situation, right? So is it just a 5-minute problem, or is it something that's really going to affect you 5 years down the road? And usually it's just a short-term problem. And that can really help to bring us some peace that, okay, even though this feels really big now, one day it won't matter at all, right? Keeping a good sense of humor is always great during a stressful situation. Can help to relieve some of that tension, and reminding ourselves that we're doing the very best that we can given the circumstances. So often we are our own worst critics. So just having compassion for yourself is incredibly important, and being patient with yourself, right? No one's perfect. We all make mistakes. We all go through difficult times. So just remind yourself of that. A second way in which we can implement an emotion-oriented strategy is by using affirmations. So, using affirmations is a useful way of countering negative thoughts. And affirmations are essentially positive statements that we can use to replace and overcome negative self-talk. So, for instance, if you find yourself habitually saying things like, I'm not good enough, or I'm not talented enough to progress in my career, try to replace that verbiage and those thoughts with rational positive thoughts like, I'm skilled and confident, um, and I believe in my own ability, right? I've also included a designing affirmations worksheet in the handout section as well. So if you do have trouble thinking of those positive affirmations and developing strong ones, I highly recommend that you try that out, to help you to develop those, and to understand just how powerful they are in our lives. There is a lot of science-based research on how affirmations can change our lives by rewiring our brains and um, sort of reconnecting the neural pathways. Um, so if you are interested in obtaining some of that research, I'm very happy to share after this session. And the third way is by practicing stoicism. So stoicism is an ancient practice that relies on 4 key principles. And those 4 key principles are wisdom, self-discipline, justice, and courage. Essentially, stoicism involves dividing our experience of the world into things that we can realistically control and the things that we can't. It makes no sense to let ourselves be emotionally affected by the things that we can't control, right? So by looking at situations in a very rational, objective way, we can reduce stressful emotions and negative thinking. And And stoicism can be particularly useful if you feel very overwhelmed by a situation and find it difficult to stay calm. By implementing stoicism, we can take a second to just pause and refocus on what really matters. And if there are multiple variables that are just out of your control, there's no reason to stress about those, right? We have to remember that we can only control what's in our control, and some things just simply aren't. And that's the way it is, right? Next, we have acceptance-oriented strategies. So, like I just said, some things are out of our control. And when we have no power to change a situation, it can definitely make us feel very helpless and hopeless. But it's vital that we move on from obstacles like this by learning how to accept these kind of situations. Acceptance-oriented strategies can help here. So these include identifying what you can control, influence, and accept. So this goes back to those same principles that are rooted in the Stoicism. So if you find a particular situation overwhelming, what we can do is use the control, influence, accept model to help us to take a more rational approach. So ask yourself, is there anything that you can control or influence to improve the situation? So for instance, could you use your skills to solve the problem? Could you ask someone else for help or advice? If you aren't able to control or influence the situation, then the best thing you can do is to adapt to or accept it. This doesn't mean that you're ineffective, passive, lazy, or unskilled. It shows that you're resilient to change, you know your limitations, you have a degree of self-awareness, and you can deal with difficult situations in a very mature and intelligent way. I've included a blank confluence, influence, accept worksheet in the resources section. Um, if you'd like to give it a shot and try it out with something that has been causing you stress recently. The second acceptance-oriented strategy is using relaxation techniques. So techniques such as meditation, mindfulness, EFT tapping, and deep breathing are all really great practical ways of combating the physical symptoms of stress, such as handshaking and shallow breathing. And these types of relaxation techniques also enable you to clear your mind and regain a calm state when you're stressed. If you're interested in exploring any of those topics in depth, we do have a series of workshops available on each of those topics on our YouTube channel. So I do encourage you to check those out. The third acceptance-oriented strategy is seeking out social support. So reaching out to your social support network. Many people suffer from stress in silence, unfortunately, because they're essentially afraid that they'll look weak or irrational if they voice their anxieties or concerns to others. And a lot of us are worried about the response that we'll get from others if we do share that we're suffering or undergoing a difficult time. But the plain fact is, it definitely helps to talk. Chatting through an issue that you have with a family member, a friend, or a trusted colleague is a great way of exploring your own thoughts and letting off some steam. It also gives you an opportunity to get someone else's more objective opinion on the issue. Perhaps they think you're doing absolutely fine. They can give you some reassurance. Or maybe they are in a position to be able to help you out in some way by giving their advice or opinion. Sometimes by sharing our situations with others, we can get more information to help us make decisions. And sometimes others can support us by helping us out with daily tasks and responsibilities such as chores or childcare, or even a task that we have at hand. Reaching out for that social support is definitely very, very beneficial. And lastly, prioritizing self-care. Look after yourself and prioritize your self-care. So taking time out of your day for you is incredibly important for your mental health and well-being. And this could look like something as simple as getting exercise, taking the dog for a walk, eating healthy foods, engaging in your hobbies, or listening to some music. Anything that makes you feel calm. All right. And if you feel like you can't cope, seek out professional help as early as possible. Here I've included some crisis lines that you can call if you are feeling hopeless and you need some additional help from an unbiased party. There's also the kids' help phone. If you have any children or teenagers living with you, it's always useful to share those with them as well, just in case that they need it. But of course, you should never feel ashamed of having to ask for help. We all need it at some point, right? And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you found the contents of this webinar to be useful, and I hope that you will take some time to download those tools and worksheets from our handout section. Give them a try, see what works for you. And I hope to see you in next week's Mental Health Mondays session. Until then, take care. Have a lovely evening. And thank you so much again for joining and for all of the amazing work you do in the pharmacy community. Have a good night. Bye.